Hi, everyone. Welcome to joining us today on AFSC's Facebook page. We are live today, 2 o'clock on this beautiful Thursday. And my name is Kristin Kumpf. I have the honor of being the Director of Human Migration and Mobility at the American Friends Service Committee. And I'm so grateful to be joined with my extraordinary colleague, Pedro Rios, who is joining us live from the US-Mexico border. And so, Pedro, I just want to turn it over to you as we start today's conversation to really look at what's happening at our border, what we're doing as a country around welcoming people into our country or not. And so would love to just hear from you a little bit of what's happening for you and what's happening where you're at, if you want to kick us off today.
Thank you, Kristin. And again, my name is Pedro Rios, and I'm with the AFSC's U.S.-Mexico border program, which is based out of San Diego. And today I am actually in Tijuana, right along the border in what is known as El Chaparral. The Chaparral is a port of entry that connects people who are crossing either from the U.S. to Mexico or from Mexico to the U.S. However, since late February, there's an encampment here that has grown to about 2,000 people, many of whom never qualified for any sort of programs, but had been waiting for several years in some cases to be able to present themselves at the port of entry. The U.S. had been administering, along with Mexican authorities, unlawfully something called metering, which is pushing people to wait longer periods of time in Mexico while their numbers were called so that they could present themselves. Consequently, when the pandemic hit, all those individuals were stuck in Mexico and have yet to have any opportunity to present themselves, an opportunity to say that they want to make a claim for asylum. And so behind me, this encampment has grown since mid-February to about, as I mentioned earlier, 2,000 people. Many of them are from different parts of Latin America. There are some people from Haiti. There are some people from the African continent who are here essentially waiting for an opportunity to present themselves. And so today, we were distributing face masks earlier this morning. Later this evening, my colleague Gina from the AFSC's Latin American Caribbean program, together with other organizations, will be passing out hygiene kits. And this is important because Mexican authorities have not provided adequate care for people who are here. Just recently, restrooms were put in place. Local businesses were charging a lot of money for people to use restrooms. So this is an important gesture for people to have these hygiene kits. And so basically that's where we're here to support them, to hear them, in some cases to record their voices so that they can speak for themselves. And what they've been telling us is they just want an opportunity to say why, to the U.S. authorities, why they want to apply for asylum and to make an asylum claim.
Thanks, Pedro, for sharing all that. And for those of you who are just joining us on Facebook today, I'm Kristin. This is my colleague, Pedro Rios. We are part of the Human Migration and Mobility Program here at AFSC, and Pedro is down at the U.S.-Mexico border. And today, we really just wanted to have a conversation about what's happening for around asylum and what's happening at the border. And we many of us have been watching the news with lots of concern and confusion, because I think we continue to see sort of, images of people arriving, of real confusion of how people are able to be let in. And I'm just curious, as the final thing you said, Pedro, is that people are there because they are there seeking asylum and they just want an opportunity to do that. I'm wondering if you could tell us sort of how you've seen that change, sort of how that used to work at the border, what the border used to be like, and now what, and to what's happening now, and sort of what's happened to create this change.
Sure. So before the pandemic, there had been something called metering, which was people were self-administering a list that they had to place their name on, and that list probably would be several months to a year before their number was called. There was a lot of problems with that list. To begin with, one is that the U.S. and Mexican authorities started that list and weren't meeting their obligations under international standards to ensure that people arriving would have an immediate opportunity to make a claim for asylum. There were also other situations taking place. We know of the Migrant Protection Protocols, the MPP. Many of the folks here did not qualify, either because they weren't from a Spanish-speaking country or they arrive later than when the actual dates to apply for MPP stopped, which was during the pandemic, or some of them were somewhere in Mexico and were trying to make their way to the border area. And then there's also the application of Title 42. This is the CDC order that Trump put in place at the guidance of racist advisor Stephen Miller to ensure that brown and black migrants would be excluded from any sort of asylum process. And unfortunately, that the Title 42 order continues to be in place for the most part, while minors are able to cross and not be expelled, and that's what Title 42 authorizes Border Patrol to expel migrants. And so consequently, that has created a situation where families here are self-separating. So where under the Trump administration, the zero tolerance policies and such created family separation. Now we're seeing that families are self-separating as a result of trying to think of ways to provide safety for their children. And so that's one of the reasons why there has been an increase in unaccompanied minors that are crossing into the U.S., as well as much more frustration by people here who have not heard any sort of ideas of when the U.S. government will permit people to present themselves for asylum. So a lot of people have been seeking alternate ways to cross into the U.S., some of which have been extremely deadly. For instance, taking small, what are known as panga boats through the Pacific Ocean and crossing into the U.S. waters. That has landed some people in very risky waters, and there has been the death of at least 3 people in the last month, as well as people trying to scale the 30-foot border wall, which also has resulted in loss of life. And so that's the situation here, and why we've been pushing for President Biden to rescind the CDC Title 42 order that allows for these expulsions to take place and gives Border Patrol so much authority to do so.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pedro, for explaining that and explaining how things have shifted, and prior to the pandemic and the Trump administration, and sort of the what we saw both from metering and then from the implementation of Title 42. And just to continue just going deeper on that, I think Title 42 is this, I think, little known public health law that was used, as you said, by the Trump administration, by the direction of Stephen Miller, to close down the border. And we're seeing the images that Pedro is showing. Exactly then what has been the result is that thousands and thousands of families have gathered at the border trying to seek asylum, which has always been protected by international law. The UNHCR, the UN High Commission on Refugees, has always said that people have a right to seek protection in other countries, and that both historically U.S. law and international law has protected that right. But what we saw in March of 2020, as Pedro said, is the Trump administration using this public health code, Title 42, to get the Center for Disease Control to pass this order that essentially closed the border to all asylum seekers. And we have since then have seen hundreds of thousands of people who have been expelled or pushed back from the border or sent back from the border, there have been almost daily flights to Haiti, for example, where thousands and thousands of Haitians have been flown back to Haiti because of this really horrific use of Title 42 to close the border for asylum seekers. And so we're continuing to see all sorts of ways that the asylum seekers are not able to live into what should be a legally protected right to seek asylum in the U.S. In addition, Pedro, I noticed when we first joined you live here on Facebook, I saw a few people walking by in military gear. And I think one of the deep concerns continues to be the militarization of border communities and of the border in its time. And I'm wondering if you could share about how you're experiencing that, both on the Tijuana side and also back on the San Diego side as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Kristin, because it's important to tie these initiatives like Title 42 within the context of how border communities have been militarized. Today, May 20th, marks the 24th anniversary of when Ezequiel Hernandez, a U.S. citizen, 18-year-old from Redford, Texas, was shot and killed by a platoon of Marines that were doing drug interdiction programs. And so consequently, we've seen how militarization impacts the lives of not only migrants who are attempting to seek a better life and crossing into the U.S., but also of border community members, those of us that have seen how Border Patrol that considers itself a paramilitary force operates in such a way that really does not respect basic constitutional protections that one would expect to have. Driving from one point of the border to another, it's common to have to cross through checkpoints. These checkpoints, oftentimes, people are questioned based on the way they look. And under the Obama administration, it allowed for racial profiling to be used for border agencies. And so we see that applied on a regular basis. And then also how border militarization gets externalized into Mexico. In southern Mexico, for instance, we see the application of policies that mimic and resemble some of the same sorts of policies that we've seen along the U.S. border with Mexico. And so it's a great concern and a slippery slope for how militarization initially degrades basic rights and protections that people expect to have, but also normalizes that violence, makes it so that people would expect the violent response for migrants that are seeking safety. Just a short distance from here is the San Isidro Port of Entry, where Customs and Border Protection have initiated these exercises where they shoot these mock flashbang grenades and smoke bombs to prepare for any possible incursion that they say of migrants trying to go into the U.S., which is not happening. But it also, what that does, it's a way of collectively punishing border community members, as well as I mentioned earlier, normalizing a violent response to people who could do better with the humanitarian needs being met. And so that's how that's connected with the militarization of border communities.
Yeah, thank you, Pedro, for making that critical connection. It's important for us to hear how that actually is playing out on the ground there. And you'll, for folks who are joining us, you'll see in the chat that there is a link to an action alert that you can take to call for reduction in the militarization of the border. We're particularly concerned, and we're all closely watching. Next week, we expect for President Biden's budget to be released. What Biden and the administration are hoping that they will get in terms of funding from Congress for the different parts of our government. And we're deeply concerned and watching very closely the money that will be going to the Department of Homeland Security, and in particular to Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, and ICE and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, because what we know is that the budgets have always been like drastically inflated again and again and again. That money has gone towards the militarization of border communities, has gone towards the detention of migrants, both at the border but across the country. And also we know that people are taking action, that this is an incredible moment where we see people taking action at the border and around the country, joining together to both call for not only a restoration, but a completely renewed asylum system where actually we are welcoming people with dignity, and again, living into our values and principles and the international law that says people have the right to seek asylum, as well as seeing the closure of detention facilities and the end of immigration enforcement as we know it. Even today, we are celebrating the fact that after years and decades of hard organizing, we're seeing two contracts that ICE had with county facilities in Georgia and Massachusetts closed down, at the Irwin County facility and the Bristol County facility. And so just today, ICE announced the end of those two contracts. And so we continue to ask the question, if we can close these detention facilities, why not close more facilities? Why not end more detention? Why not end more border militarization? And so I'm wondering, Pedro, what your calls to action would be in this moment. What are the calls to action of the people at the border, of border communities, for this time? How can we join with you all to be taking action in this time?
Thanks, Kristin. I think some of the action alerts that hopefully will be placed on the chat, and I think that's the most important way. But one of them is to let members of Congress connect with the White House about the importance of removing Title 42, of rescinding the Title 42 CDC order. That's one important way. But also working with your local communities, wherever you might be at, and looking locally how to support some of the way your support is local, but also having a national impact.
Yeah, I think we lost you for just a second, but I think what I heard you say, Pedro, is that this is an important time to work with our local community. You did, it's okay. But I think what we heard you say is it's an important time to work with our local communities and also work with our local members of Congress, to be calling on Congress and the administration to be taking a chance in this moment, to be able to really say that this is what we need, and to end the inflation of our military budget, of our the budgets for ICE and CBP, the militarization of the border, and especially in this call to end Title 42. I think, is that what you were trying to say? To call members of Congress?
Exactly. Ending Title 42 and working with your local communities to defund these agencies that are creating so much harm in our communities. We're part of a national effort seeking to defund hate, and it's important that as many people as possible are heard on that very specific claim. We know that both CBP and ICE have caused tremendous trauma in our communities, and so that will continue unless people speak up and unless people are really heard on that important issue.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pedro. We've got a few questions coming in, and I want to invite others who are watching us right now to please put your questions in the chat. Pedro and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have, either about what's happening there locally at the border, as well as some of these national policies that we can all make an impact in changing. And so, Pedro, there's a question coming in from John in Iowa. If you could just talk more about, do you know if the migrants there in the encampment have organized themselves in any way? Oh, looks like the Mexican police are going by. So in the midst of all of that's happening there, are the migrants themselves organizing in the encampment in any way? And what are the unique challenges faced by Black migrants? We already noted that we know that there are thousands of Haitians who have gathered, and we've seen thousands and thousands of Haitians who have been expelled and sent on flights back to Haiti, as well as there are other African migrants there as well. So wondering if you can share anything about how the migrants are organizing, and if you know of any of the unique challenges faced by Black migrants there.
Yeah, I didn't hear the first part of the question, but in regards to Black migrants, certainly and absolutely, there are both institutional and structural obstacles and factors that discriminate Black migrants specifically, both in the U.S. and Mexico. In Mexico, for instance, there's a lot of discrimination that takes place. There are a lot of barriers because of language barriers, so it's much more difficult for someone who doesn't speak Spanish, who might be coming from an African country, from Cameroon, for instance, to be able to navigate the cultural nuances in Mexico versus someone who's coming from Central America, from El Salvador, for instance, who is able to sometimes pass as Mexican and be able to converse in Spanish. In the United States, we've seen that Black migrants who are detained face even greater challenges with having to pay enormously expensive bonds in the tens of thousands of dollars compared to migrants that are not from African countries or who are not Black. And so these are both structural, they're both institutional, and they're also cultural. And it's extremely difficult for them to be able to navigate the systems. There are some organizations in Tijuana that are much more tuned into the challenges that Black migrants face, and so we certainly appreciate all the work they've done, especially when there was a large number of Haitians that were coming to Tijuana about 4 or 5 years ago, and many of whom have remained since then here in Tijuana and in the greater Baja California area.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We're watching the militarization right behind us of these communities. And so the other question was, in the midst of all that's happening, are the migrants organizing themselves in any way in the encampment? Do you have a sense of any sort of organizing that's happening among the migrants themselves in the encampment, Pedro?
There is some level of organization. At the beginning, there was some level of creating a security team because, and I won't say this too loud, because there are people that are kind of hang out and trying to see how to take advantage of migrants here. There have been some extremely violent confrontations together with the arrival of very vocal anti-migrant U.S.-based people that have come and have live streamed and have had conversations with people that those conversations are then used against them. There have been incidents of attempted child kidnappings. So there are some very dangerous situations in the encampment, along with everything else, a lack of proper hygiene availability, not having adequate information, lawyers, people who call themselves lawyers coming in and taking money from people who are here, claiming that they'll represent them, all sorts of challenges. And so there is some level of organizing when those challenges arise, but there's also, to be honest, a lot of tension within the encampment. Some of that tension is based on racial prejudices. Some of it is based on ideas that migrants from certain countries have better access to information and to benefits than others do. So a lot of complex situations that people are dealing with here that oftentimes create barriers to a much more organic and fuller level of organizing.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Pedro. It's been incredibly concerning that we just recently saw a human rights report out that there have been, since the implementation of Title 42 and the expelling of people and the people waiting along the border, there have been over 492 reports of kidnappings and rapes and other violent crimes against migrants who are just waiting to seek asylum. And so it's a deeply, deeply concerning issue when we look at how the border continues to be closed and how something is like just this Title 42 policy continues to block, again, both the legal right and the humanity of like people being able to seek asylum. And so as we get ready to wrap today, again, we just want a final reminder, if folks have any questions, please drop them in the chat. And we'd love to take those questions either here live or we can get back to you. I want to ask you just one last time, Pedro, if there's any final words that you want to share, any final words of advice or things you think we should know about the situation, and any calls to action. And just want to share as you're doing that AFSC is very proud to be joining with other organizations at the border and all over the country in the launch of a new campaign called Welcome with Dignity. That campaign will be launched this coming Tuesday. Out of that, we are going to be working to advocate both for the expansion of the asylum system and the immediate end to Title 42, as well as the protection of people on both sides of the border and the ongoing development of communities that are welcoming across the country. So we really hope folks will join with us. There are several action alerts again in the chat. Please go to those alerts. Please let your members of Congress know. Set up a meeting with your members of Congress. That's the best way to do it, to get the message directly to your members that we do need to call for an end to Title 42. Ask your members to call the administration directly. Reach out to them so that they can be calling for the administration to end Title 42. Please ask them to also take a stand when the budget is released as they're trying to make decisions around the future pockets of money, that they are cutting back the budgets of ICE and CBP and cutting back the militarization of our communities and the detention of migrants at the border and across the country. So with that, Pedro, are there any other final thoughts, words of advice, things you want folks to know today?
Just thanking everyone for their support, thanking them for tuning in. Migration is something that has been going on for a long time, but I think there is a proper way for governments to respond, and unfortunately, they have not been doing it. And those who are most impacted are the little ones, the children that are here. There are a lot of children in this encampment, many of whom don't have access to basic necessities that all of us take for granted. So support AFSC, support your local organizations, those that are doing the work on the ground, so that we're able to have a greater impact in meeting the basic humanitarian needs, but also challenging the structural problems that have caused so much suffering for so many years.
Yes, thank you so much, Pedro, for that reminder, and thank you again. Thank you again so much for your work, for the decades of work that the U.S.-Mexico border program has been doing in the San Diego-Tijuana area, for your years of work there, for being there today with other colleagues and being in the encampment, passing out masks and other aid items and other ways that you're supporting the migrants there, and for calling us to remember both the humanity of people the stories behind the stories. So as we see the visuals of children on scooters and running by together to remember the lives that they are living and the violence they've fled from potentially, and also the dreams that they're seeking, and that we can be a part of trying to make sure that our government has the pathways needed to make sure that people can live out those lives and those dreams. And so please, friends, please go to the different action alerts that have been dropped in the links today. Please join us as we launch the Welcome with Dignity campaign with other colleagues around the country next Tuesday. Please do call your members of Congress. Please ask them to call the administration in Title 42 and to cut back the budgets of ICE and CBP, and continue to join us in AFSC in all the ways we're seeking justice, including our next Facebook Live next Thursday. So we'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Thanks, Pedro. Take care. Bye now.